So let's take a look at renderings. That's just a word for a color, two-dimensional representation of something that you're trying to create and show somebody else. Our client is usually a director or a producer when we're working in theater, and we have a great range of tools that we can use to create a rendering to show our ideas to people before they are designed. So I'm going to walk through a variety of different media that you can acquire, the common ones that are you're most likely to encounter, and then just give you some words of wisdom about how to proceed with this. One of the things I want to just draw your attention to is the reference images that you used when you were creating your design. Whatever it was you pinned up on the wall that inspired your design originally, make sure those aren't in a drawer somewhere when you go to do your rendering. You really want to go and look back at those, pin them back up on the wall and look at the colors and the textures and the surfaces of things. What were the things that really inspired you to grab that picture in the first place? You should be looking at that before you do your rendering. There's also plenty of ways for you to work out the perspective. We've talked about that in other lectures. You can make a little sketch model that's just out of cardboard and folded bits of paper to use that to look at. In fact, you can even just kind of walk around your house and find things that are about the right size and then take a picture of that and then look at that on your phone. That'll make it a sort of a 2D flattened out view of it. That can help you get the perspective correct. So we've talked about that in other tutorials, so I don't want to spend much time there. But one of the other things that you might consider is just a simple SketchUp model. You know those skills now, so you can use the tools in a simple digital program like SketchUp to not worry about making a full CAD rendering, but you can come in and just put in the walls and the platforms and the big masses of shapes and then print that out, or even import that into some other software like Photoshop and paint right on top of that. It's just a way for you to get all your perspective worked out ahead of time, so that's available to you. I also think that going back and looking at the thumbnail sketches that you did when you designed the set is important. I'll have these very early sketches that are just sort of, just for me as I'm working out my ideas, but oftentimes there'll be something in those original thumbnail sketches that are just on the back of envelopes and recycled paper. There'll be something that I want to go back and catch in a rendering that is important. I'll show sketches, thumbnails like this to a director, and then the director may have responded to something. Even if it was a thumbnail sketch that didn't end up in the final design, if a director was drawn to a particular image, it might have been the pose of the little figures or something about it. That's worth remembering, making a little note of that at the time, and going back and looking at those sketches before you start doing your rendering. And that's true of any kind of storyboarding that you might have done or sketching out a particular scene, and you might go back to some interesting pose that you did in a thumbnail sketch and use that as material for your renderings. That's true of your storyboards, whether it was your kind of creativity storyboards or your proof of concept storyboards that you were doing. There's two different versions that we'll talk about in a different lecture. I do that all the time. I'll just draw on tracing paper or newsprint or whatever, and I'll just use some pen and ink, and maybe I'll throw some design marker on for color just to make it a little bit clearer what I'm looking at. But a lot of times sort of buried in these very crude, kind of quick, sketchy ideas is something that I want to recreate for my renderings, and that'll lead to a preliminary rendering that's part of the design process. This might be something that you show to a director, and then you're scribbling on it in a meeting and making notes. There might be 3 or 4 different versions of these, but go back and look at those preliminary renderings that were part of your discussion with your director early on, or if even it's something that never was shown to a director, but it was part of your earlier process. Anything that you've generated up to this point is worth taking a look at again before you start to draw out your rendering. Eventually, you're going to have something like this that maybe you have drawn. In this case, I drew this on tracing paper, and I knew I wanted to use other kinds of media that were not going to survive on that tracing paper. So I just take it and photocopy it. And then once you have the photocopy version of the drawing that you want to preserve, I mean, you want to preserve your nice sketch, whether it's something that you did on tracing paper or bond paper or any kind of media, that initial sketch that is like, that's what I want my rendering to look like, go ahead and photocopy that. Don't forget that you can even scale it up or down. If it's a little too small, maybe you drew it on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, but you want to blow it up twice as big to 11 by 17, you can do that with the photocopier and play with scale and play with all kinds of things before you transfer it over to your final material. So how do you get a photocopy onto your illustration board or your watercolor paper or whatever? Well, you can do this sort of homemade carbon paper process by transferring your image. So what you do is you take that photocopied page and you flip it over and you grab a soft lead pencil, like a 9B or a 6B or whatever you have. You can use a number 2 in a pinch. And then you're going to just go ahead and rub the back of the paper all over where there are lines on the other side. If you've got 4 inches of cyc at the top, you don't have to cover all that with with graphite, because you don't have any lines up in there. Just draw where your lines are on the other side and cover it over with your homemade carbon paper. And then you're going to tape down your final material, whether it's watercolor paper or illustration board or whatever it is that you're going to paint onto. Tape that down onto your table or your worktop, and then flip over this homemade carbon paper and put it on top of your final material, very carefully making sure that you've got it oriented nicely, that it's not crooked on there. You really want to take some care before you tape that down too. Don't try to do this process without taping both pieces down, or else it's going to shift on you and things are going to get misaligned and you're going to be very upset about that. Once you've got them taped down, then you're looking at the photocopy side with the graphite underneath against the material that you're going to paint on. And I usually use a red pen or some kind of colored pen, ballpoint pen, and I just trace over all the lines. Just draw over the lines on the photocopy. You can use a straight edge, you can use any kind of tools you want, and that's going to transfer the graphite on the back onto the surface of your watercolor paper or whatever you're using. Then lift it up, don't peel it away and take it off until you double check to make sure you haven't missed any areas. That's the nice thing about the colored pen, is that it makes it really easy to see where that you maybe have missed a few lines. But once you're pretty sure that you've got it all, go ahead and peel it up and set it aside. Don't worry about every single little detail. You can draw in the props and little ornament pieces. All that kind of stuff can come in by hand after you transfer the image. What you're really trying to catch is all the work in perspective that you did, the staircase or the handrails or all the things that are going to be really kind of hard to recreate. Do all that, and then you can always come back and add the little fun ornamental bits by hand on top of the final material. You can, of course, use charcoal as well, but I think that the graphite is better, the pencil lead, because it's easy to erase any smudges or pieces that you don't want. The charcoal is a little harder to erase. I just want to mention neatness in general. When you're working with wet media, especially when you're new at it, you're going to make mistakes and there's going to be drips and splashes and things, but do your best to make this final presentation piece that you're going to use as neat as possible. So but you're going to make some kind of mistakes or some kind of little errors, so minimize all the other ones that you can control, like don't bend the corners or don't get smut on it or whatever. Just make sure that you've got it as clean as possible so that it has a professional look before you turn in that rendering. Let's take a look at wet media here. The most common ones that you're going to encounter, and they're pretty ubiquitous, are watercolor, gouache, and acrylic. You can get these anywhere. They have them at Ace Hardware here in Ashland, the bookstore, Bi-Mart. You can go into any art store in the country, even office stores, Staples, that kind of thing are going to carry these kinds of materials. And you'll find that the watercolor is the material that is most commonly assumed that people are going to be working in theater. Now, if you were a theater student, say 30 years ago, the assumption would just be, well, yes, we work in watercolor. That's what we do. We have a whole lot more media choices available to us today, and they were available back then, but they just weren't used as much. And the problem with watercolor, I really like watercolor. I like how fast it is. It's fairly inexpensive. You don't need a lot of tools. It's a pretty good material to use. The thing about watercolor is it's really kind of hard. It's not an easy technique to pick up, and you're certainly not going to do it in a couple of renderings from me in my class. So don't try to master watercolor. It takes years to become really, really good at this. This is a Turner sketch here that he's done with watercolor, preparing for a little study for a painting, and it takes a lot of effort to get good with watercolor. What we're trying to do with a watercolor rendering in theater is not trying to paint from scratch on a white piece of paper all of the little details. You're going to do a lot of the work with a pencil or with pen and ink, that sort of thing, to really get the shapes and forms. And then you're going to use the watercolor to really create mood. You're going to do big washes of color to get the suggestion of light and shadow and highlights and that sort of detail. So if you look at these three examples here, they're not really precise in their details. They're really evoking a mood, and that's what renderings do better than models. They get a sense of the mood of what it's going to look like under the light and show conditions. Even a real master like Joe Melziner is using, this is a thumbnail that he did in watercolor for Death of a Salesman. It's not the final rendering, but you can see that maybe you've seen the final rendering or seen photos of the set, and you know kind of what's going on in the house there. Well, there's the boy's bed upstairs, and there's a kitchen table and some doors, but if you didn't already know that, all those kind of horizontal gray lines in there would be really kind of difficult. You get the sense of the house and the trees and the buildings in the background, and certainly Willie trudging home, but all the details are really kind of left out of the rendering, or in this case, the little study. So you don't need to worry too much about details in this. Even Melziner, who was a real master of the media, here's another one of his renderings, has got, this is kind of sketchy and fuzzy. The watercolor is a very sort of almost ethereal kind of media, so don't worry about too much detail just with the paint. Here's a Boris Aronson rendering of the Crucible, and if you look at that black above the set there, it's very brushy. It's not really applied very well, but it doesn't really matter because he's done a great job of evoking the space in there. But he is painting straight on with the brush to create the space, and I recommend that you don't do that. That instead you do this. So you transfer over with your graphite technique your pen and ink or your pencil or whatever kind of black and white media you want to put down onto the paper, and then use the watercolor to wash on color, to give it a sense of light and highlight and shadow, and sort of to tint the painting or the drawing. It's a long tradition of pen and ink with washes of color that artists have been using for years. So this is a beautiful rendering. All of the details, the door, the chandelier, the figures, the furniture, all that is that black and white media, pencil or pen or whatever the artist used. And then there's washes of watercolor going on top. So it is a color rendering, and it's beautiful, but the paint is not being used to get all that little detail and all the little architectural bits. That's all being done with a pencil or an ink pen, and the color and the light is being created by the watercolor. So really be aware of that. Here's another good example of that, where you can see the pencil lines still in there. This is a simple rendering that's really evocative of the mood of the piece, and it's not terribly clear. There's some stuff on that cabinet over there. I'm not sure. It looks like there's a picture in a photo frame, and some kind of knickknacks. I'm not too worried about what all those specific things are. I get the sense of the checker floor and the armchair and the lamp and the overhead lamp. I mean, those are the real key things that you need to communicate with that rendering. The mood and the basic shapes. Don't worry about little fussy details. That's really hard to do in paint. This is one of my watercolor renderings of Philadelphia Story. This takes a long time to do a rendering like this. So we tend to do a watercolor rendering for a unit set, something that's not going to change a lot, and then we'll do a model for all the scene changes or storyboards or thumbnail sketches or whatever to show all of the different configurations. So in a set like this, for this play, where the set didn't really change at all, that's great to do a watercolor rendering for that kind of design, because it does take a long time to do a rendering of this level. I just wanted to throw this one in here. This is the very first rendering I ever did for a show that was actually built. This was this first show I did as an undergrad at the University of Portland called Magic Theater, and it was a children's show where there was a little balloon factory, and we brought in white balloons and they got colored and polished and so on. It was kind of a cute show. But there it is, my very first watercolor rendering. What I tend to do now is not so much a rendering like that Philadelphia Story, the final deliverable, but I will use watercolor frequently in that final sketch that's getting the director's approval. So this is an example here. I probably drew this out in pencil with ink pen. Looks like there's some Sharpie markers or something like that. Photocopy that onto cardstock paper, which is not ideal, but I do it all the time. It's kind of a cheat. And then I photocopied onto that cardstock and then use design markers and watercolor washes to give it some tint and some color in there, and then showed that to the director and said, what do you think? And then got the final yes or no on the design from the director at that point. So then I will go off and make a model from there, or a more high quality rendering. So I tend to use watercolor as a quick way to get some ideas across as opposed to a final version. Here's the same thing for a production of Proof. I did in the Bay Area a while back. So, a little bit more tiny detail with smaller brushes, but same idea. Even in these watercolor renderings, this is some really old one here. I'm looking at all the pen that I came back in with, pen and colored pencil, and little black lines to strengthen some of the details. Very little of it is being done with just straight up watercolor. This one is maybe an exception. I think this stuff is mostly painted. I can sort of see the transfer lines from when I did the little graphite trick on this, but a lot of the foliage and the furniture and things is all just straight paint, but that's kind of rare. This is a really old rendering of mine. Watercolor comes in two different forms. The really cheap stuff or the really expensive stuff tends to be in the little dry pans like the one on the left, and then the mid-range stuff is usually in fluid tubes. Again, you don't need to buy a bunch of paint. If you've got some friend of yours that can lend you some, or somebody who took this class last year, or whatever, try to share them because you need so little paint, especially for the small amount of painting that I'm asking you to do for this class, that you just don't need to go out and buy a big kit. If you want to, great, especially if you think you're going to paint more frequently than just this class. I think that's fantastic. But know that one of those little tubes, a little 2-ounce tube, that'll last you years. I have tubes of paint from grad school. I usually throw a tube of paint away when it dries out and the lid cracks and it's not worth trying to salvage. I very rarely throw out an empty tube of paint. What I tend to do when I'm getting paint out of a tube is I take off the cap and I don't squeeze the tube. I set the tube aside, and I take my brush and I clean the cap. I just run a wet brush through around the inside of the cap, and what gets stuck to the brush is usually enough for the amount of watercolor that I need to create. So you're using tiny little amounts of this, so don't feel like you need to go out and spend a bunch of money on watercolors unless you intend to start a hobby with that. This, again, all these techniques that I'm not going to be able to teach you in this class, that, different wet on wets, and you could basically take a 10-week course just on watercolor painting and become like an intermediate beginner, So it's the sort of thing that to really master the technique takes a lifetime. We're really using watercolor to throw washes of tint onto a rendering. So really think about it that way. Watercolor is great because it's very saturated, very vivid. You can mix it very easily. You don't need to get dozens of tubes of paint. If you get some couple of good quality tubes of paint, you can mix your own colors, with some basic color theory. It's very easy to do. So it is an economical way to get color on renderings. And that kit of tubes, that if you do buy them, they will last you for years. Again, it's this sort of big, bold washes of color. We're not really worrying about fussy little details. Let's talk about gouache. Gouache is very similar to watercolor. In fact, I have them all mixed together in my kit. Watercolor is completely translucent, and you start from white and you build up layers, whereas in gouache has a little bit more opacity to it. So you can put a little blob of white on top of some red, like in the example here, which you couldn't do with watercolor, unless it's a titanium white or something that is intending to do that. So gouache is nice and useful because it's kind of halfway between watercolor and acrylics. It still has the feel of watercolor, the very light, washy feel, but it has some opacity, which makes it very useful to work with. And you can get a little kit of gouache, and you can see there's some white there at the end that you wouldn't normally find in a watercolor kit, because the white is going to be the paper. If you are going to buy some paints for yourself, I really highly recommend M. Graham. They make watercolor and the gouache and acrylics and oil paints and just pretty much everything. And they're a great little kind of mid-range quality. They're not super cheap, but they're also not real swanky, and it's a couple of dollars per tube. And again, one of these little tubes, these little 5-ounce tubes, will last you for years. And they're made in Oregon, which is a great thing. And you can tell the difference between the watercolor because it has the 3 stripes and the gouache has the 1 stripe in the middle of the label. As for brushes, you don't need a bunch of brushes. You probably need like 2 or 3 different brushes. I recommend a couple of little rounds that are a little kind of pointy so you can get into small details. And then I tend to have larger brights or flats because that little hard corner, that little 90-degree corner, is really useful for what we're doing in set renderings, which is a little bit more architectural. We're trying to do trims or doorways or that sort of thing where that square corner can be really useful. If you have a bunch of round brushes from a costume design class or something like that, they're fine. You don't need to go out and buy brushes if you already have some brushes, as long as they're decent quality brushes. And you really need a couple of small ones and a couple of larger, I'd say a 6 or an 8, which is about half an inch, for a bright or a flat. You don't need any of the fancy little fan brushes or whatever. If it comes in a little kit that you buy, that's fine, but you just need a couple of simple brushes. I really recommend that you just get one of these little brush kits, and if you can find these ones that I have on the right here is the brand that I'm recommending here. It's a Talcon brush, is a synthetic fiber, and it's this orange bristle that you'll see, and it has a clear plastic blue handle. And that particular brand it's a lousy brush, but for how cheap it is, it's a really amazingly good brush, because you can spend a lot of money on watercolor brushes if you are going to be a professional watercolor artist. You can spend hundreds of dollars on brushes, but for this class, you can get a kit even cheaper than this $11.99 here. You can get a little kit at Bi-Mart if you're here in Ashland with these kind of brushes in them for like $5.99, and it's got like 6 brushes. It's got a couple of different sizes and shapes, and that's perfect. If you can find one of those, that's excellent. So those little orange bristled brushes, and they're going to be real soft. They're going to feel very almost like a makeup brush to your fingertips. If it has any kind of coarseness to it, that's going to be a problem. We'll talk about that next. I'll also talk about hake brushes, which are Japanese watercolor brushes. Oftentimes have a bamboo handle. These are fantastic brushes because they're so inexpensive. Like a 3-inch brush like this is going to be like $2.99, whereas in a 2-inch watercolor brush by Winsor & Newton or something is going to be like $70. I mean, just incredibly expensive for a similar kind of brush of the same width. But you can get these brushes. Again, they're in the bookstore, they're in Ace, they're wherever you want to find your painting tools, you're going to find them, and you're going to pay $2.99 for one of these little wood-handled brushes that are great for sort of big washes of color. So I recommend that in addition to the little kit of brushes that you get. But what I don't want you to use is those stiff bristle brushes. If you pick up some brushes and the bristles feel very coarse and very springy, they're probably made for acrylics or oils, paints that have a lot more weight to them, and they're not going to be good for your watercolors. You don't want to get any kind of the black bristle brushes because those are for solvent kinds of paste, things like shellacs or lacquers or whatever. You can stay away from those. And also just don't go down to the scene shop and grab some chip brushes. Chip brushes aren't even made for paint. They're actually called chip brushes because they're meant to brush away the chips of metal from like metal shop tools, so it's meant to be a broom, not a paintbrush. And we use them all the time in scenic art, don't get me wrong, but that's kind of a different scale of painting than what you're going to do here in this class. So you have a terrible time if you're trying to paint with a 1/2-inch chip brush. And then lastly, I think Crayola has got a scam going on. They have a marketing plan of making the worst brushes in the world, so kids will, when they're trying to use paintbrushes, will be so frustrated they won't want to paint and they'll go back to buying crayons. So anything that Crayola makes is just awful, and it's going to bring you to tears. Also, I've already alluded to the fact that I use the wrong kind of paper frequently. I'm printing onto cardstock and painting right on the cardstock. I do it all the time. It's not ideal. If you were going to do a full actual rendering, it's worth getting some watercolor paper or even just some illustration board, especially if it is sized for watercolor. That's really good stuff. You want that heavier material to paint onto. You don't have to go out and get a full 24-sheet pad, although if you do, they're not that expensive. They're $8-10 for a watercolor pad. But do be careful of the kind of paper that you're getting. For our renderings, we really want to fairly smooth cold press or actually maybe even a hot press. So if you have that wonderful kind of homemade paper feel that's really rough and beautiful, that looks lovely and that's beautiful for painting horses in the snow or something, but we need a little bit smoother surface because we got to come in with all these fine details. Even if we're coming back in with a pen or a pencil to draw those in, if it's a really coarse surface, you're going to have a hard time with that. So you want the paper to be fairly smooth. And the reason why we use watercolor paper is that it is primed and sized to actually accept the watercolor much better than any other kinds of paper. So you're just going to have a much better result with that. Or you can paint with other medias on illustration board. I recommend them that as well. And you can buy both of those individual pieces at the SOU bookstore. We need to do a lot of masking when we're working with watercolor. You can cover over an area of your rendering that you've already painted with some, even a paper towel or something, just to keep drips and keep your sleeve out of the paint. But we oftentimes may want to cut out something that serves as a little bit of a mask to protect an area while we're painting on others. You can use masking tape, of course, but straight up masking tape that we're used to using has a really heavy adhesive on it. So if you are going to use that, you will probably want to stick it to your jeans a couple of times to kind of knock the tack down a little bit so it's not quite so sticky, or you can get tape that's actually made for this purpose. You can use drafting tape as well. That's kind of a nice happy medium, and we have a lot of that floating around the building. But if you do use masking tape to mask out an area, make sure that there's not a lot of bridges underneath it. Take your fingernail and kind of burnish down the edge a little bit to make sure that it's nice and flat. The side that's not getting paint on it, doesn't even need to be stuck down, but the side that you are going to put your brush up against needs to be nice and flat. It's a good idea too to start your brush on the masking tape and paint away from it rather than starting at the opposite side and pushing that tidal wave of paint toward your tape. Little tricks like that will help. If you start to peel up your tape and it starts to tear, stop immediately. Even if you think it's just a little tear, it'll be fine. Stop and go get some kind of heat source like a blow dryer and get that tape hot so that the glue will soften up and you'll be much less likely to tear the paper surface with that masking tape. So be real careful of that. If you're going to do a lot of watercolor, you might want to get a little bottle of liquid frisket, or masking fluid as it's called generically. It's not very expensive. It's basically just rubber cement in a fairly fluid form that you paint onto your surface, onto your paper, before you do any watercoloring on it. And then when that dries, it protects the paper underneath. It just keeps the white paper protected. And then you can do all your washes of color on top. And then when that's dry, you can come back in and just peel it all off. So you basically are just painting over the areas that you want to protect and keep white, and then doing your wet washes on top of it, knowing that it's going to keep the paper underneath nice and white, nice sharp edges. It takes a little time to do, but it's a lot easier than cutting out lots of fussy bits of masking tape. And the masking tape is much more likely to fail and letting paint get underneath it than the frisket is going to. Don't forget that watercolor is really all about light and shadow. It's kind of big shapes. Can't repeat this enough, that it's not about painting in fine details. You also want to be patient in terms of it takes time to add layers of these colors. You're really building up a color. So you're going to go over and do a wash of the whole thing, and then once that's dry, you're going to come back in a little bit and do another wash to darken down some areas or to add some shadows and things. So it is a very time-consuming process. You're not painting a lot, but you can't just start a project at 9 o'clock the day before it's due and have enough time to do that. So even though you're not necessarily having to sit there for hours watching the paint dry, you can do a little bit and then go do some other things, and things you can hurry along with, like with a blow dryer. But you really want to give yourself plenty of time, startup time. So don't put this off, because watercolor renderings do take time, even if it's not your time the whole time sitting there doing it. You also need watercolor. Watercolor needs water. So what I tend to see a lot with students is they're putting too much paint out onto their tray. They're squeezing out half an inch of paint, which is far more than you need. And then they're trying to paint it like acrylic. So they're painting it straight up or thinned slightly. And watercolor wants to be really the consistency of coffee. I mean, it wants to be fluid so that it's just flowing right off of your brush. And it needs to have almost an ink-like consistency. That's what we're after, those washes. If it feels like it's going on like glue, it's way too thick and it's way too dry. On the other hand, rushing it, putting wet paint onto an area that's not quite dry yet, will result in these little blooms. It happens to me all the time because I'm always rushing and I'm impatient. But if you do take the time to let it dry, you can avoid the little accident like what's happening on the tomato on the right by letting the layers thoroughly dry before you add wet paint to it. But just remember that watercolor bleeds. It's part of the medium. It's why we have these misty morning watercolor paintings that look so lovely. So don't worry too much if you get a little bit of feathering, a little bit of bleeding, or some little dry edges in there. Is it ideal? No, but it's not the sort of thing that you're going to be able to solve after a couple of tries. It's the sort of thing that you spend years and years trying to control and master. And then use a large brush, and then only switch to the smaller brush when the large brush is just too big to fit in the areas. Don't come at your cyc, for example, in your rendering with a little 1/4 inch brush, because first of all, it's going to take a lot longer, but then every time you do a little stroke with the brush, you're leaving a little hard edge that's going to dry in funny little lawnmower lines into your artwork, and you don't want that. So just big, quick washes. That's why the masking and the frisket, things like that, are useful, because you can just go over all of the edges and do a nice big quick wash, and then go have lunch, and then come back when that's dry and do more details, pull up your masking. I've already mentioned this already, but the idea of having a blow dryer nearby is super useful, because we don't have the time to lay down a wash of color and then go read some poetry for a while. We got to get these things done. So having a blow dryer at hand is going to speed that up a lot. But be careful that if you've got a big puddle of paint on your surface and you come at it with a blow dryer, you don't want to push a bunch of paint across the surface in places you don't want. That can happen very easily. You are going to want some kind of palette to work with. It can be anything. You can get an actual paint palette. I typically tend to use the little styrofoam trays that you get your cheese on or whatever. White ones are best, clearly, so you can see the color of your paint. But pretty much anything will work in terms of something to mix on. But you do want something that is clean and something that is can keep your paints separated, like these actual little paint pans. Those are very useful. Or I've used ice cube trays in a pinch or whatever. It will stay in your ice cube tray. But what's great is I'll go to the Goodwill and get these little pill containers, and they're perfect because you can snap the lid on them. Now remember, watercolor will rehydrate with water if it dries out, but I tend to use lots of different kinds of media. I bring in acrylics and stuff, and those will dry out. So having the little lids to snap down is a great way to store your paint for more than one sitting. Speaking of acrylics, that's another common kind of paint that you can use. And acrylic paint is very much related to the latex paint that we use on our houses and on our scenery. So latex paint is just acrylic paint with vinyl to stretch it, because acrylic straight up is pretty expensive, and the gallons of paint we need to paint a house or a set would be very expensive if we were using straight up acrylic. But when you're buying a little 4-ounce bottle of it, you can get pretty good saturated high quality acrylic paint, even for an economy version like Basic or Blick that you can find pretty much anywhere. Those are great acrylics to use. They're nice to paint your models because they are very opaque, and they behave just like latex paint, so they go terrific onto models, but you can also paint them on your renderings as well. Watercolor, gouache, and acrylic are perfectly interchangeable. They will mix and match with each other, and that's terrific because they're all water-based. Don't try to bring any oil-based paints to this party or you're going to have problems. Notice that the acrylic is much more opaque than the gouache, and the gouache is much more opaque than the watercolor, and that can be a good or bad thing depending on what you're trying to achieve. Acrylic paint has a lot more body, and you will squeeze out a lot more of acrylic paint onto your palette than you will with a watercolor, where you need that tiny little grain of rice sized bit of paint. Well, with acrylics, you are going to use that toothpaste tube squeeze to get the paint out that you want, because it does need to have more paint to cover what you want. But you can thin it down, and it will behave very much like watercolor paint when it is thinned. The one disadvantage to acrylic paint is that it is a little shiny. It's very plastic. So if you're trying to do a rendering of something that's sort of old and weathered and sort of a memory play or whatever, and you don't want it to look kind of plastic and shiny, you might stay away from acrylics, because acrylics will have a certain sheen when they dry. Here is a rendering I did in acrylics a long time ago, and you can see this brush strokes in it. It's thicker, so it tends to hold brush strokes. You do get kind of a nice vivid color, and then those they're also opaque, so that you can paint on top of other colors. That makes it very easy to do. I like this one a little bit better. This is Two Gentlemen Verona that I did mostly with acrylics, and there's actually even some impasto on there, where you actually take the acrylic on the stucco walls there, and I kind of stippled into the paint to create an actual surface texture. So if you run your finger over this rendering, it actually feels kind of rough, and that was kind of useful for what I was trying to create with the stucco. So that's a good thing to do. And you get varying results. I feel like this one's a little painterly, looks a little brushy, maybe not my favorite. But acrylics are really good for painting quickly and bold, and you don't have to worry so much about the multiple layers. That's another advantage over the watercolor. They can look a little heavy and a little kind of gloppy compared to the watercolor's subtle luminosity, but it's faster because you just lay the paint down, and you have to worry about all of the steps, and you don't have to worry about leaving this area white so that you can paint over it with a lighter color later on. You can just paint opaquely, and it's going to be kind of thick and painty looking, but it's fast and easy to use. If you are a little afraid of the wet media and you want to kind of cling to the control of colored pencils, you can invest in some watercolor pencils. And a little kit of a dozen or so isn't too expensive. And instead of taking the pigment in the pan and taking your brush and getting it wet and moving the pigment onto your paper, with a watercolor pencil, you're just basically rubbing the pigment onto the paper. And then the watercolor is wetting the pigment that's on the paper. And you get a lot of the same control that you get with a pencil, and then you get the final effect of watercolor. So a lot of students like to play around with watercolor pencils. They're great for kind of adding in shadows and things like that afterwards. So having those around is handy. You can get them in a pencil form, or you can get them in a stick form, kind of like a crayon, and they both work just as well. A lot of students want to use colored pencils, and that's fine. I encourage you to do that, but be aware that for colored pencils to look good and not to just look like a kid coloring in a coloring book, it takes a lot of effort. So this great Richard Dahlstrom rendering over here has a lot of work on this. I mean, if you look at like the gray outline behind the ceiling there, there's a lot of parallel strokes. It's really working the pencil a lot to get the saturation color that doesn't just look like kind of a little scribble. You really need to work the pencils and put some effort into it to make it look not like, what's behind the little tin of pencils in the picture at the left there. If you can look up in that corner, you can see where somebody's kind of just colored in a little bit. It looks really kind of rough and scratchy. There's lots of different techniques that you can use, cross hatchings and various kinds of shadings, and going over with different layers to get a nice effective light with colored pencil. So it's a great media to use. I just encourage you to consider how much time it actually takes to make it look good, because it does take a lot of control. Just like any other media, you can use it kind of quick and crude and get some results, or to make it really look good, it's going to take a lot more effort to do that. So you're going to want to do lots of parallel hatching lines. You can see those parallel lines in this rendering here on the right, where the artist took a lot of time to lay down a lot of pigment to get those deep saturated areas. So that's all. Just bear that in mind if you're going to use colored pencil. I don't use colored pencil usually because I'm just too lazy, don't have enough time, except I will do this little technique occasionally where I will work with dark media like black illustration board in this case, and then put on colored pencil. I think there's probably some gesso on top of this and some white pastels, a few other things involved with this, but basically it's a very dark monochromatic play, and so instead of painting in all that black, I just started with a black background and added white and kind of built in the other direction, painting in highlights, drawing in highlights instead of drawing in shadows the way we normally work. So that's a method that you can play around with. I love design markers and pens. I think they're really very useful and very versatile. There is an investment in those, but they have a fairly short learning curve. The pen and ink drawing style that's very common to architects and illustrators is very classic. People have been using it for hundreds of years. It's beautiful and it looks really good. There's all kinds of hatching techniques that you can employ. You can also get technical pens like people draft with, which have different diameters. So like that .05 pen right there, that's the same .05 diameter lead that's in your mechanical pencil. So you can draft with permanent ink, as people can do. And there's a wide range of pens that you can use. You can even use a fine tip Sharpie in a pinch. Those are fine. Or you can get real high-end pens like the one there on the bottom. And you can see the different line weights that can come in a kit of pens. So you're welcome to play around with that. You can also use just regular straight up permanent ink. So India ink that comes in little bottles like this, and you can pour that into a little inkwell and use it with like a calligraphy brush where you're actually dipping the nib of the brush into the inkwell, or these can go into various technical pens that you can use, like the Rapidograph, which is a very high-end pen. Originally, I think it was German, and I think it's made in Japan. I had one for years, or a couple of ones. They're like $30. They're really expensive. They're really the Cadillac of technical pens, but they're kind of hard to maintain. They're just more trouble than they're worth, in my opinion. But if you really love the pen and ink style, and it is a beautiful style to work in, you might consider treating yourself to a Rapidograph because they are pretty amazing. But if you can also just get a simple fountain pen that is at a bookstore or whatever, even a little plastic fountain pen that you get for $8 or $10 can be really a pleasure to work with. I've used one for years and I miss it. I need to go back and use that again more. So you can, usually the fountain pens have a little plastic cartridge that you pop inside the pen that has some ink, a little ink reservoir. You don't need to dip it in, like Shakespeare. Although you can just get a simple calligraphy set in an art store and just dip your pen right into the inkwell. Either way, I would encourage you to play around with this because it is a really lovely way to work, and the ink flowing out of a fountain pen is just unlike anything else. It's just not the same using a felt marker or a mechanical pen or any of those sort of things, rollerball, that kind of stuff. It's really a beautiful media to work with, and there's a long tradition of like travel art, this kind of thing, somebody's travel journal where they've done some permanent ink and then gone over with a watercolor wash. It's a lovely kind of media to work in, and architects and travel artists and illustrators have been using it for centuries. The one on the left here has design markers over on top of it, and the one on the right has just got a wash of some gray watercolor or something. But I want to draw your attention to this one because you can see the black and white lines are fine, but really what the interesting thing is of this little rendering is, or this little sketch, is the sunlight coming between the building halfway down the alley. Well, there's no way for you to show that sunlight in this picture without shadowing the other areas. So just drawing out the lines that make up the building and then washing over with that gray allows that one little U shape right there in the middle to stay white so that it looks like luminescent, like sunlight. So it's a really beautiful effect. It's so easy to do with some permanent ink and then some washes of colors, or even gray in that case. Design markers are really what most designers are using today. They're a lot of fun to use. They are an investment, but they are very evocative, very effective in what you can do with them. Architects and fashion designers and concept artists, and they're not using watercolor. They're not using gouache and acrylics and things. They're using design markers. So you see that widely used in the fashion industry, in illustration for comics, for concept art. It's pretty common that you're going to find all sorts of professionals using design markers to create their renderings. Here's a good example of a architectural rendering of that. I love to use my design markers, especially in the preliminary stages. So I'll do a quick little sketch like this one, and then I'll just throw some color on with the design markers. And I'm not too worried about getting the perfect color. I'm just trying to make it a little bit more clear to show a director what I have in mind by using those pens. Here's another version where, again, you can see it's just pencil lines with some black Sharpie lines or whatever to reinforce it, and just some color thrown on. It's really quick. It's a great way to get some color onto a drawing quickly. The only rendering of mine that I could find that was almost entirely design marker was this one. This is a You Can't Take It With You I did a while back, and I can even see there's some pen lines in here. There's some white colored pencil or China marker or something like that for some highlight marks, but most of this is done with design markers. But I tend not to do the full rendering in design marker. I tend to use that in the preliminary stuff, as I say, stuff like this where I can just take a piece of newsprint and just use some pen and ink on there and then throw on some color the way I couldn't with wet media. On newsprint or cheap paper or whatever, if I came at it with wet media, it would just make a mess. But here I can make a few marks with a design marker and get a suggestion of that. Design markers have got great ranges. The good brands are going to have a nice range. By the way, I'm saying design marker, which is a professional marker, which is different than the little felt tip markers that you got when you were a kid. Those are not great. So again, if you have just the right color and you need to do a little detail somewhere, that's fine for a little small touch of something, but don't try to use, cheapy kid markers in place of design markers. We are talking about a kind of a professional sort of pen here. Most of them are going to have different kind of chisel tips, so you can get different sizes of line. They usually have two ends as well, so there'll be a fine tip on one end and a big blunt tip on the other end, or they'll have a kind of a brush tip, like the Tombow, which is a great little line of pen. These are fairly inexpensive. They were my gateway drug into design markers. I got a handful of different gray pens, and it was great to come in and drop some shadows on some pencil drawings or whatever. I would recommend that you play around with that. If you're curious, get a couple of these little Tombow markers in like 10%, 20%, 30% gray, that kind of thing, a little range of grays, and just play around with the way that you can really create some highlight and shadow with these kinds of pens. And they're like $1 a piece. They're not very expensive. They've got the normal sharp point on one end, and they've got the soft brush tip on the other. That's almost like painting with a brush. They're a lot of fun to use. Coptic is a big brand. Dick Blick makes their own kind of knockoff brand, which is fairly decent. Prismacolor is one of the professional brands that you can find out there. My favorite is the Chartpak AD markers. These have a different kind of solvent in them. They use Naphthol, which is a little smelly and probably not so great for you, but they blend beautifully because that solvent kind of flows across the paper and it has almost a watercolor kind of quality to it. So they're really lovely to work with. Now the drawback is all of these design markers are very expensive. To buy them one at a time, which is the most expensive way to do it, you're going to spend like $4 per pen, maybe a little less than that. So the way to do it is to get one of these little kits, even though I've never done that. I've always bought them one-off slowly over the years. They last a long time. If you keep the caps on them, you'll have them for years, but you got to keep the caps on them because they will dry out in minutes if you leave the caps off. But a little 144 pack like this one over here in the corner is great. You just look for a coupon or a sale or whatever and get it, 20% off. And that's a great way to invest in it. It's a big initial investment, and you can get smaller packages. You can get, 24 pens or whatever for $24 or something on sale. So it's an investment, and you need a pen for every color that you want to use, although you can blend colors together. It's a really terrific tool, and you can grab a couple and drop them in your pocket. You don't have to worry about the mess and the cleanup that you do with the other kinds of wet media. So I really recommend the design markers, but they are an investment. Pastels are very evocative and they're very saturated, especially oil pastels, which really need a solvent to work well. I've used chalk pastels occasionally, but they're really hard to control and you don't get a lot of detail with them. You really need to be working in a big format, or you need to just go for an impressionistic feel like the painting here or the pastel drawing here, because you're not going to get a lot of fine detail. The only rendering I've ever done with pastels is this one, which you saw actually the sketch of this earlier on. This is a play that's set in a barn and the walls were kind of luminescent. They were being projected on. It was just muslin walls. And I wanted to get that sense of the luminosity, and I also wanted to get the kind of coarseness of it. So I just went over with pastels to draw that. And there's obviously pencil and things in there too, but it's mostly those pastels that's making this. But that's a hard media to work in, but you're welcome to play with it, but I wouldn't recommend it. Everybody is basically doing digital art. Now, there's a big learning curve and an investment in software and tools to become a digital artist. But professionals working in any kind of industry that's creating artwork, with the exception of maybe like children's illustrations for children's storybooks or whatever, pretty much you're not working in concept art, painting in watercolor. You're not working as a designer for game assets or whatever in media that's other than digital art. Pretty much everybody is using Photoshop or GIMP or Canvas or several other different kinds of Painter. There's other kinds of programs that are out there that allow you to paint digitally on your computer. And the great thing about that is that you're able to paint with layers. You can have undo. You can try something and say, ooh, that's terrible, and just hit undo, or save it for later and think about it, and, turn things upside down. It's a really very powerful tool, and the tools are getting so sophisticated now that they look a lot less computer generated. There's a lot of brushes and things that you can use that simulate natural media, which is pretty cool. I will use it a lot. I'll paint in Photoshop. Here's an early draft version of the Mr. Burns set. This was a really quick render in Vectorworks that just basically had the shapes and the seats that are over there. Everything else I painted in Photoshop just with my tablet. So the people and the foliage and the tent and all that kind of stuff, the cracks and things, all the junk on the walls, I did that all in Photoshop after the fact. I love to do that, to draw something and scan it and bring it into Photoshop and stretch it and tint it and make changes to it and flip it upside down. It's such a wonderfully plastic tool to use that I encourage you to play around with it. Now you can do completely digital renderings, like several that I've done here, where the whole rendering is in Vectorworks from start to finish, or in Cinema 4D is another software that I use. And most of the work is being done by the CAD program. However, you can do a real hybrid version, which I'm getting more used to these days. I've kind of gotten back into that. And that's like what I did for the Mr. Burns rendering that I've just completed, which is, this is the final version. And here is what came out of Vectorworks. So a lot of the lighting and a lot of the structure is there, but the tarp texture that I put in that back archway just looked terrible. And obviously I wanted to add some figures to the scene and a few other little details and some little touches to it. So I did this by painting in all of the foliage, using actual photos of people that I merged into the picture and made the lighting look like they were being lit by that fireplace there, by the fire pit. Added some other little elements here and there. Of course, all the tiling at the bottom. I threw in some color on the gels of some of the light fixtures, and it makes it look a much more lively kind of scene than the other view. And I could do all of that in Vectorworks, but it would take a lot longer. And in some ways, it's a lot faster just to take it into Photoshop, and you've got a whole lot more kind of control. And then you can see exactly what's happening. You don't have to wait an hour for your render to finish to realize, oh, that doesn't look anything like what I'd hoped it would look like. So it's a great way to work both ways. You can create a SketchUp model and take that into Photoshop and paint it, or you can print out that SketchUp model and paint traditional material onto it, or you can go back and forth. You can do the SketchUp model, print it out, throw some watercolor washes, scan it, bring that colored traditional media colored scan back into Photoshop and tweak it. There's any workflow that works for you. Nobody's going to come and tell you you can't do that. So the nice thing about working digitally is you can work in layers. Like here's some line art from a SketchUp model. Here's just the shadows on a separate layer. Here's the textures of the walls on a separate layer. Here's what's beyond the windows, the sort of jungle detailing, and here is it's unfinished, but here's a composite of all of those different layers kind of stacked up together. And you can control each of those layers separately when you're working digitally, and that's kind of exciting. Now, professionals who are doing this all day long are working on monitors that they can actually draw on. They're very expensive, thousands of dollars for those kinds of monitors, but you can get yourself a little drawing tablet like this person here has, and use your monitor to work on and draw on your tablet. It's much less expensive. It takes a little hand-eye coordination to get used to that. I have the larger version of this one here on the left, and I just love it. It's a Wacom tablet Intuos 4, really useful, but it's a couple $100. However, if you're interested in this, I would recommend that you look at the little one on the side here, which they're really creating to be a kind of a gateway drug here to get people interested in this. These are like $70, even cheaper if you get them on sale. And they have all kinds of reviews by professional graphic artists that are saying, hey, this is a kind of a neat little tablet. And they're getting copies for themselves to use with their laptops so they can go to the coffee shop and work on things with these, and they can leave their big expensive stuff home in their studio. So if you're curious about this and you don't want to drop the major investment of getting an actual drawing tablet or certainly one of those monitors, you can get one of these for like $100 or less than $100, and get into the world of using digital art. Now you can also use your mouse. I used my mouse and Photoshop for years before I broke down and got the tablet. And again, there's a little bit of a learning curve. When you first sit down to use the tablet, you're going to think you can't do it. But like anything, it's like riding a bicycle. Once you get used to it, it's a lot easier than you think it's going to be. And lastly, I just want to kind of wrap up by saying, I've said this a number of times throughout this, and I just want to reinforce this idea that there is no rendering police. You can use any kind of multimedia. So here's a rendering of a show that actually never got built, but this was originally a pencil drawing with some colored pencil and design marker maybe. I don't know. I can't remember all the steps. And then I think at some point it was scanned into Photoshop and some things were kind of punched up and then printed out again. This is one of those processes that I'm talking about where you can really, different iterations, run it through different ways and really get a result that you like. Here's a rendering that's all pen and ink with washes of acrylic on top of it. You can, also by the way, I should talk about paint elevations, which isn't a rendering so much, but it's along the same kind of process. Set designers want to paint the scenery flat for the scenic artists that need to paint it. So a paint elevation is basically kind of a map for the scenic painters to create the paint treatments on the scenery in the scene shop so that it looks like what you want it to do. So even though it's not a rendering, but it's something that I'm not asking you to do for this class, but it's something that set designers do, which is paint these paint elevations and using the same kind of materials or media that they would paint a rendering. And just lastly, I want to show you a couple of your classmates, former students' renderings. This is a nice rendering for, I think, Hamlet, perhaps. I can't remember exactly what this is, but I like how the student here put this nice little light source in the middle of it. So he's got this sort of torch. You can kind of enter through this little center tunnel here, and he really made it kind of glow with that light source. He did a great job on these stairs here. His perspective is pretty good, but also look, he's got this bright side that's facing the audience, facing the lights, and then the tops, the treads, are brighter than the vertical kick plates of the stairs. And then deep underneath the archway here, it's this nice deep dark shadow. He's done the same thing off the front of the stage here. So you can really see the way that different washes of color can really help sculpt the space in a nice job. It's missing a figure, but oh well. Here's one with a figure. This is all pen and ink, and the student, I think you've seen the model of this in the modeling tutorial. The student did a nice job of just really bright, vivid colors, and just with all pen and ink, no wet media at all here, but again, it evokes the scene nicely. And this is one that's not really great on the details, but really evocative. She did a nice job with this kind of powerful feel, and these interesting stairs that she's got curving up, and those banners kind of in the background, and now that she's got this sort of exploding brush strokes with the black paint in there. It has a real kind of a Robert Emmons Jones feel to me. So it's a really nice example of what you can do. So these kind of renderings are what you need to do for the Set Design 1 class, maybe a little bit more refined if you're a Mott student. But this is really what we're looking for, is something that's very evocative of the color and the mood and not getting hung up on the details in there. So hopefully this has been enlightening for you and you'll be brave enough to jump right in and create some fantastic renderings.